On the morning of September 8th, 1983, in Little Falls, Minnesota, a bank president named Raymond Clausen, Jr. drove his brown Buick out to a farm in Morrison County and made an offer he was certain no reasonable man would refuse. He had done his research. He knew the numbers. He knew what the farmland around Little Falls was selling for that fall, which was considerably less than it had been selling for 3 years earlier, because 1983 was the third year of what people in Morrison County were already calling the worst farm crisis since the Depression. Banks across the Midwest were calling loans. Farms that had been in families for 2 and 3 generations were going to auction. Raymond had attended 4 of those auctions himself in the last 18 months, and he had not enjoyed any of them, but he understood them. That was the business. The Lund farm was different. Raymond had been watching it for 2 years, not because the Lunds were in trouble. They were not in trouble. Raymond had been watching it because of what it produced and what it was worth and what he thought he could do with it. If he could get it away from the old man who had been farming it since 1962. He pulled into the farm lane and sat in his car for a moment, looking at the fields. 80 acres of the blackest soil he had ever seen. Not the dark brown of ordinary good Minnesota farmland. Black, pure black, the color of used motor oil, perfectly flat, growing the tallest, straightest rows of onions Raymond had ever seen on any farm in any county. The smell reached him even through the car windows, rich and mineral and alive in a way that ordinary dirt was not. Raymond got out of his car with his leather portfolio and walked to the field edge where Arvid Lund was working his way down a cultivation row, moving slow and steady the way he always moved, his enormous black-stained hands working the soil between the rows without hurrying, without stopping. "Mr. Lund," Raymond called. "I'd like to talk to you when you have a minute." Arvid looked up once. Then he looked back down at his row. He finished it. He walked back to the field edge. He stood there in his plaid shirt and his black-stained canvas trousers and looked at Raymond the way a man looks at weather coming in from the west. Patient, assessing, not yet concerned. Raymond opened his portfolio. He had prepared a written offer. He had never done that before with a farm acquisition. He had prepared one for the Lund farm because he wanted everything to be clear. The bank was offering $900,000 for the 80-acre muck parcel, not the whole farm, just the muck ground. Cash close in 30 days. Arvid looked at the paper for a moment. Then he looked at Raymond. "Your father offered my grandfather $4 an acre for this ground in 1921, Arvid said. Said it was worthless swamp, not worth lending money against. Raymond kept his expression neutral. "Times have changed, Mr. Lund." "They have," Arvid said. He handed the paper back. "Not for sale." Raymond blinked. He had not expected that to be the end of the conversation. He was prepared for negotiation. He was prepared for a counter-offer. He had not prepared for 2 words and a returned document. "Mr. Lund, this is $900,000 for 80 acres that your grandfather paid $320 for in 1921. "I know what he paid," Arvid said. "Then you understand what I'm offering." Arvid looked at the black field behind him, at the onion rows running straight and dark to the far edge. He looked at Raymond the same way his grandfather Nils had looked at the swamp in 1921, the way a man looks at something he understands deeply and has no intention of explaining to someone who does not. My grandfather knew what was under that water, Arvid said. Your father did not. He looked at Raymond. I know what this ground is worth. You know what it's worth. We just have different ideas about who it belongs to. He picked up his cultivation tool and walked back into the row. Raymond stood at the field edge for a moment, portfolio under his arm, looking at those black onion rows. Then he got in his Buick and drove back to Little Falls. Let me tell you about Arvid Lund, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he was protecting. Arvid was 66 years old in the fall of 1983. He had farmed the Lund place his entire adult life, taking over from his father Eric in 1962 when Eric's heart gave out during spring planting at the age of 64. Before that, Arvid had worked that ground alongside his father since he was old enough to lift a bushel crate, learning the muck fields the way you learn something that is always underneath your feet, slowly, completely, without being entirely aware it is happening. Arvid had never grown corn. He had never grown soybeans. He had never participated in the commodity markets that were eating his neighbors alive in 1983. He grew onions, carrots, and potatoes on the muck ground, selling to vegetable brokers in Minneapolis and St. Cloud, who had been buying from the Lund farm since his grandfather's first harvest in 1929. He grew oats and hay on the 20 upland acres at the south end of the property, enough to feed the animals and put something back in the soil. He had no debt. He had never had debt, not a single loan in his name, not a financed piece of equipment, not a mortgage on anything. His grandfather Nils had paid cash for the land in 1921. His father Eric had paid cash for everything he ever bought. Arvid had continued that way because it had never occurred to him to do otherwise. It was simply how the Lund family farmed. But there was something else about Arvid Lund that the bank and the land speculators and Raymond Clausen, Jr. did not fully understand, even when they looked at those black fields and saw the numbers. They saw the value. They did not understand the source of it. They did not understand what Nils Lund had seen in 1921 in a cattail swamp that every other farmer in Morrison County had driven past for 40 years without stopping. Let me tell you about Nils Lund and the swamp, because that is where this story really begins. Nils Lund came to Minnesota from the Trondheim region of Norway in 1909 at the age of 22, with $140 in his pocket, a change of clothes, and a specific kind of knowledge that most Norwegian farm boys carried without knowing it was valuable. He knew how to read a bog. In Norway, peat bogs were part of the agricultural landscape in a way they were not in America. Norwegian farmers had been cutting peat for fuel and draining boggy ground for farmland for centuries. Nils had grown up watching his father drain sections of coastal bog, building tile systems, cutting drainage channels, and revealing underneath the standing water a black, dense, extraordinarily fertile organic soil that grew hay and vegetables and grain crops without needing any fertilizer at all. The soil was the fertilizer. Thousands of years of plant growth had composted itself into the earth layer by layer until the organic matter content ran 8, 10, 12%. Ordinary mineral soil in Minnesota ran 2 to 3%. Peat muck soil ran 20, 30, sometimes 40%. It was not dirt. It was compressed biology. Nils had watched that black soil grow things in Norway that the upland mineral soil could not approach. He knew what it looked like from the surface when it was still underwater. He knew the vegetation types, the way the cattails grew taller and thicker over deep muck than over shallow. He knew the specific color the water turned at the edges of a productive bog. He knew how to probe the bottom to feel the muck depth through a pole. He had carried that knowledge across the Atlantic and through Ellis Island and up through Wisconsin and into central Minnesota, where he spent 9 years working other men's farms, saving money and looking for the thing he had been looking for since he arrived. He found it in the spring of 1920 on a Sunday afternoon when he was driving a borrowed wagon along the Morrison County road that ran north out of Little Falls. He saw 80 acres of cattail marsh on the west side of the road, and he pulled the wagon over without entirely deciding to. He climbed down and walked to the edge of the marsh and stood there for a long time looking at the cattails. They were 12 feet tall in places, extraordinarily dense. The color of the standing water at the edges was dark and mineral, the way water looks when it is sitting on top of something organic. Nils pulled out the tile probe he carried in the wagon and waded in to the knee. He pushed the probe straight down through the standing water and into the bottom. It went down and down and down, 6 feet before it hit resistance. He pulled it out and looked at the material on the tip. Pure black muck, dense and rich, and smelling of 10,000 years of decomposition. He stood there in the water for a long time, the way he stood when he was certain about something. He went home and spent the winter calculating. The following spring of 1921, Nils walked into the Morrison County Farmers Bank in Little Falls and asked to speak with the president. The president was Raymond Clausen Sr., a man of 58 who had been lending money in Morrison County for 30 years and considered himself a sound judge of agricultural land. Nils explained what he wanted. He wanted to buy 80 acres of cattail marsh on the North County Road. He had saved $280. He wanted to borrow another $40 to make the purchase. Raymond Sr. looked at him across the desk for a moment. Then he laughed. Not a cruel laugh, a banker's laugh, the kind that carries within it the specific confidence of a man who has made a career of knowing which land was worth something and which was not. "Son," he said, "that is a swamp. You could not grow a crop on that ground if you tried for 100 years. "I am not going to grow it as it is," Nils said. "What are you going to do with it?" "Drain it." Raymond Sr. laughed again. "With what?" "You've got $280. Drainage tile costs money. Labor costs money. That project would take 10 years and $5,000, and at the end of it, you would have wet, flat ground that might grow some hay." Nils looked at him. "I know what is under that water," he said. "I have seen it before, in Norway. When you drain it, what is underneath is the richest crop ground you have ever seen." Raymond Sr. shook his head. "I cannot lend against swamp land. There is no collateral. If you default, I am holding 80 acres of cattails." Nils stood up. He had expected this. He thanked Raymond Sr. for his time and walked out. He bought the land anyway. He found the owner, a timber company that had logged the surrounding upland 40 years earlier and considered the swamp useless for any purpose. And he offered them $4 an acre, $320 cash for 80 acres of standing water in cattails. The timber company took the money before he could change his mind. Now let me tell you about the draining, because it is the part of this story that nobody talks about. They talk about what the land became. They do not talk about what it cost to get there. Nils spent the summer of 1921 surveying. He borrowed a transit level and walked the perimeter of the swamp 40 times, mapping the elevation, calculating the fall, determining where to put the main outlet ditch and at what depth. The water needed somewhere to go. There was a small creek along the east fence line that sat 8 feet below the surface of the swamp. If he could get water to move from the swamp to the creek, the drainage would work. The math said it was possible. He dug the outlet ditch himself. 30 inches wide, 6 feet deep, 480 feet long, entirely by hand and by a rented wheeled ditcher, pulled by 2 horses. It took the entire summer of 1921 and most of the fall. By November, the main ditch was open and the swamp had dropped 8 inches. He spent the winter planning the tile network. He had enough money left for exactly 600 feet of 4-inch clay tile. He laid it the following spring in the lowest section of the swamp, connecting to the main outlet ditch. The water dropped another 14 inches by August. He did this every year. A little more tile, a little more drainage. A little more of the swamp surface emerging from the water, black and wet and rich beyond anything the upland fields could produce. By 1925, he had 40 acres drained well enough to work. By 1928, the full 80 acres was out of standing water. He drove a probe into the exposed muck in the fall of 1928, and it went down 8 feet before it hit mineral soil. 8 feet of pure black organic matter, the richest agricultural soil in Morrison County, possibly in the state. He planted onions in the spring of 1929. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever understood something so completely and so certainly that you were willing to spend 8 years proving it before anyone else could see it? Have you ever worked towards something that had no visible reward for half a decade, while everyone around you watched and said nothing encouraging? That is what Nils Lund did from 1921 to 1929. 8 years of drainage work on ground that still looked like a swamp to everyone who drove past it. 8 years of answering the same questions from neighbors and the bank and the county extension agent. 8 years of knowing what was coming and not being able to show anyone until it arrived. The first onion harvest in 1929 was 680 bushels per acre. The county average for onions on upland mineral soil in a good year was around 200 bushels per acre. Nils Lund harvested 680 bushels on land he had paid $4 an acre for 8 years earlier. At the prevailing price of $1.40 per bushel, his 40 planted acres returned $38,080. His total investment in the land in 8 years of drainage work was $2,940. He had recovered his entire investment in a single harvest. Raymond Clausen Sr. heard the number at the feed store in Little Falls that October. He drove out to the Lund farm on a Thursday afternoon and stood at the edge of the muck field and looked at the harvest operation. Nils was there, overseeing the pulling of onions with 2 hired men and a horse-drawn harvester. Raymond stood at the field edge for a long time. Then he walked over to Nils. "I was wrong," he said, "about the land." Nils looked at him. "Yes," he said. He went back to watching the harvest. That was the end of the conversation. Nils Lund was not a man who needed an apology confirmed. He had already been paid. Now let me tell you about what the muck farm produced over the next 50 years, because the numbers are the story. The muck soil under the Lund farm had an organic matter content of 34% when first tested by the University of Minnesota Extension Service in 1931. Ordinary Morrison County mineral soil ran 2.4%. The muck required no commercial fertilizer because the organic matter itself supplied nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium at levels no artificial input could economically replicate. The Lunds added manure from their small cattle operation and composted vegetable waste from each harvest, putting back what they took out, building the biology year by year. The muck grew onions at consistently 600 to 800 bushels per acre, 3 to 4 times the yield of upland ground. It grew carrots at yields so high that the Lund farm became known to vegetable brokers across the upper Midwest as a reliable source of premium product. When other vegetable growers had a drought year or a disease year, the muck held moisture so well and the soil biology was so active that the Lunds almost always had a crop. They grew through the Depression without losing a year. They grew through the war without losing a year. Eric took over from Nils in 1948 and continued exactly what his father had established. Same crops, same drainage maintenance, same cash-only operation. Arvid took over from Eric in 1962 and continued what his father had continued. By 1983, the Lund Muck Farm was producing vegetable crops worth between $180,000 and $240,000 per year in gross revenue. Operating costs, with no debt service and no fertilizer purchases, ran approximately $38,000. Net income, somewhere between $140,000 and $200,000 per year from 80 acres. The average Morrison County corn farmer on 400 acres in a good year netted $60,000, and that was before the crisis hit. The corn farmers around Arvid had borrowed heavily during the good years of the 1970s. They had bought land at $2,400 an acre and equipment at figures that had seemed reasonable when corn was $3.60 a bushel. Then the interest rates climbed past 20%. Then corn fell to $2.10. Then land values dropped 40% in 3 years, and the collateral behind their loans was worth less than what they owed. By the fall of 1983, 17 farms in Morrison County had either been foreclosed or were within 6 months of foreclosure. The Morrison County Farmers Bank, now run by Raymond Clausen, Jr., who had inherited the presidency from his father in 1974, was holding distressed loans on 8 of those 17 farms. Raymond Jr. had watched Arvid Lund's muck ground for 2 years. He had done the math. If the bank could acquire those 80 acres and develop them into a commercial vegetable operation, leveraged with modern equipment and professional management, he believed the return could service considerable debt and still turn a profit. He had investors from Minneapolis interested in agricultural land. He had a plan. What he did not have was the land. And that brings us back to September 8th, 1983, and a returned paper and a man walking back into his onion rows. If you want to know what Arvid Lund said to the bank over the next 2 years, what it cost a proud banker to understand what he was actually looking at, subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me if there is land in your family that someone once called worthless. Raymond did not give up after the first visit. He came back in March of 1984 with a revised offer, $1,050,000. He had a signed letter from a Minneapolis investment group. He sat in Arvid's kitchen with his portfolio open on the kitchen table and laid out the case as clearly as he knew how to lay it out. Arvid listened to all of it. He poured Raymond a cup of coffee. He sat with his enormous black-stained hands wrapped around his own cup and looked at the kitchen table for a while. "Your father came to my grandfather in 1921 and told him that swamp was worthless," Arvid said. "Not worth lending $40 against." He paused. "My grandfather spent 8 years draining that ground one tile line at a time, by hand, with money he had saved working other men's farms for 9 years. He looked at Raymond. "The value in that field is not the soil. The soil was always there. The value is the 62 years of work that made it what it is." Raymond waited. "If I sell it to your investors from Minneapolis," Arvid said, "they will grow it hard for 10 years and then sell it to somebody else." He shook his head. "That soil took 10,000 years to form and 8 years to drain and 62 years to bring to what it is." He looked at Raymond. "My son will farm it for the next 30 years. My grandchildren after him." He paused. "That is what it is worth to me. Not a number." Raymond closed his portfolio. He looked out the kitchen window at the muck fields, dark and flat in the March light, waiting for spring. "I understand you have no debt," Raymond said. "Never have." "Not even in the bad years?" "There have not been bad years," Arvid said. "Not on that ground." He looked at Raymond. "Your father told my grandfather he would never grow a crop on that swamp. He was wrong about that." He paused. "What do you think your father would say if he could see those fields today?" Raymond was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think he would say he was wrong about more than the land." Arvid nodded. "You can tell him that," Arvid said. "I expect he already knows." He stood up. The meeting was over. Raymond drove back to Little Falls. He never made another offer on the Lund muck ground. Let me tell you what happened in the years after, because this story does not end with a returned offer. Raymond Clausen, Jr. spent the next 4 years working through the farm crisis, the way bank presidents work through crises, slowly, painfully, with the specific exhaustion of a man who is managing other people's catastrophes while his own institution absorbs the losses. By 1987, the Morrison County Farmers Bank had restructured 11 farm loans and foreclosed on 6. The foreclosed properties sold at auction for between 40 and 60 cents on the dollar of what was owed. Raymond's bank survived, but it was thinner at the end than the beginning. Arvid Lund's muck farm had a net income of $163,000 in 1984, $178,000 in 1985, and $191,000 in 1986. He bought one of the foreclosed farms at the 1986 auction. 40 acres of upland mineral ground that shared a fence line with his muck parcel. He paid $31,000 cash. He planted it to oats and clover and spent 3 years building the organic matter before he grew anything on it for sale. He was not in a hurry. Raymond heard about the purchase at the feed store. He heard that Arvid Lund had attended the auction in his truck, had sat at the back, and had bid on one parcel and gotten it. He heard that Arvid had paid cash from a personal check and driven home without talking to anyone. Raymond drove out to the Lund farm one more time that fall, not with a portfolio, not with an offer. He parked in the farm lane and walked out to where Arvid was clearing the fence line between the new parcel and the muck ground. Removing the old wire and posts, opening up the boundary between the two properties, Arvid saw him coming and kept working. Raymond walked to within 10 feet and stood there. "You bought the Hendrickson ground," he said. Arvid pulled a fence post. "I did. Cash, yes." Raymond looked at the muck field visible beyond the fence line, the black surface, the last of the carrot tops being turned under for the winter. "I came out here in 1983 and 1984, Raymond said. "I thought that ground was worth more in other hands than yours." Arvid said nothing. "I was wrong about that," Raymond said. Arvid looked at him for a moment, the same look his grandfather had given Raymond's father in 1929. Patient, complete, finished. "Your father was wrong about the swamp," Arvid said. "You were wrong about the farmer. He went back to pulling fence posts. We are making progress." Raymond stood there for a moment. Then he laughed. A real laugh. Not the portfolio laugh, not the bank president laugh. Something more like the laugh of a man who has finally heard the right answer to a question he has been asking wrong for 40 years. He drove back to Little Falls. He stopped at the extension office on the way and asked for the soil maps for Morrison County. He had never looked at them before, not really, not the way Nils Lund had looked at the swamp vegetation in 1920. He sat in the extension office for 2 hours, going through the maps, looking for the dark organic soil symbols, the ones that marked where the old bogs and marshes had been drained or were still standing. Nobody in the county had been asking about those parcels. They were sitting there in the maps, the way the muck had been sitting under the water in 1920, obvious to anyone who knew what they were looking at, invisible to everyone who did not. Let me tell you about 1995, because that is where this story closes. Arvid Lund retired from active farming in the spring of 1995 at the age of 77. His son David had been working the muck ground alongside him since 1978. His granddaughter, Karine, David's daughter, had spent every summer since she was 9, learning the fields the way Arvid had learned them, the way Eric had learned them, the way Nils had spent 8 years learning what was under the water. The summer of 1995 was the first summer Arvid did not work the fields himself. He sat on the porch of the farmhouse and watched David and Karin manage the onion harvest from a distance. The black fields, the tall green tops, the harvest equipment moving slowly down the rows the way Nils's horse-drawn harvester had moved in 1929. Raymond Clausen, Jr. drove out to the farm that August. He was 63 years old, recently retired from the bank, and he had brought his grandson with him, a boy of about 12, because he wanted the boy to see the muck fields. He had been thinking about what to tell the boy all the way out on the county road. Arvid was on the porch when Raymond pulled in. Raymond walked up to the porch steps. Arvid looked the same as he always had, older now, the hair completely white, the hands still enormous and black-stained, even in retirement. "You're watching?" Raymond said. Arvid nodded. "David's got it." Raymond's grandson stood in the farm lane looking at the black fields with the wide-open attention of a child who has never seen anything like it. Raymond watched the boy. "My grandfather told Nils Lund that swamp would never grow a crop," Raymond said. "Nils proved him wrong. I told you the land would be worth more in other hands. You proved me wrong." He looked at his grandson. "I brought him out here so he could see what being wrong looks like." Arvid looked at the boy. Then he looked at Raymond. "What does it look like? Raymond looked at the black fields stretching to the cattail border at the north edge. Like something worth understanding, he said, before you decide it isn't. Arvid was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. That's about right, he said. They stood there for a while, watching Karen drive the harvest equipment down a long, straight row of onions, the black soil turning up clean and dark on either side, the same soil Nils had pulled from under 8 feet of standing water, one tile line at a time, the same soil that had fed 3 generations of Lunds without ever needing a loan or a bag of fertilizer or a single year of forgiveness from anyone. Let me tell you the last thing, because it is the thing Nils would have wanted you to know. The muck farm is still producing. David Lund and his daughter Karen farm it now. The soil organic matter content, last tested in 2018, was 31%. It has dropped 3 points from the original 34 over 90 years of farming. Not because the Lunds have depleted it, but because organic matter always decreases when you farm rather than leave ground fallow. They are working it back up. They are adding compost, adding cover crops, farming it the way Nils intended it to be farmed, taking what you need and putting back what you can. The 80 acres Nils Lund bought for $320 in 1921 was assessed at $2.4 million in 2020, not because prices went up, because the soil went deeper and richer every decade, because 3 generations of careful farmers built on top of what the first one found, and because muck ground like this, properly maintained, does not wear out. It improves. Raymond Clausen Sr. called it worthless swamp. He was looking at the water. He never thought to ask what was under it. Nils Lund pulled out a probe and pushed it down through 6 feet of standing water into 8 feet of black organic gold and held it there until he was sure. Then he spent 8 years of his life making everyone else sure too. That is the difference between a man who knows the price of something and a man who knows its value. The banker had been in the business of one. The farmer had been in the business of the other. Across 3 generations, the business of value won. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the farmers who looked past what everyone else saw and found what everyone else missed, who bought what nobody wanted and built what nobody expected, who had no debt because they had something better, the knowledge of what their land was worth and the patience to prove it. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, is there land in your family that someone once called worthless? I would like to know what it turned out to be. The muck is still black, the drainage tile is still running, the onions are still coming up in straight dark rows. Some things are not worthless. They are just waiting for someone patient enough to see past the water.